The
You
slap
clumsy
landed
fool!
before anyone saw it coming. One moment
You will
Lila was
regret
standing
this.
at table 7, tray in hand, an apology already forming on her lips. The next, Kai Park's open palm connected with her left cheek so cleanly, so deliberately, that the sound of it cut through the music like a crack of thunder in a closed room. Her head snapped sideways. The tray hit the floor. The glasses shattered. And for a single suspended moment, everyone within eyeline of that booth went completely still. Kai didn't even blink. He looked down at the spreading stain on the front of his suit, then back up at her, and said one word. Clumsy. Lila straightened slowly. Her cheek burned. Her eyes watered, not from grief, not from fear, but from the sheer physical shock of it. She turned her head back toward him with a steadiness that made the two women in the booth exchange a glance. She leaned forward, just enough, just close enough that only Kai could hear her above the bass lines rolling through the floor. You'll regret this, she said. Not loudly. Not with shaking hands or a breaking voice. She said it the way you confirm something you already know to be true. The way you say winter is coming. The way you say the tide will turn. Kai's eyes narrowed by exactly one fraction. Lila picked up the tray, descended the 3 steps from the elevated booth, and walked back through the crowd without a single backward glance. Her hands were completely steady. Her face revealed nothing. But something had just begun. Before we go any further, if this story already has your attention, hit that like button right now, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment below telling us whose side you're on. Because what Lila does next is going to change everything, and you do not want to miss a single second of it. Now let's go back to where it all started. Club Obsidian was not the kind of place you stumbled into by accident. You were either invited, employed, or connected. And if you were none of those things, the two men at the entrance made sure you understood that quickly and quietly. The club sat in the heart of Seoul's most expensive district, its exterior deliberately understated. A black door, a small sign, a single overhead light. No queue. No visible bouncers dressed in matching uniforms. Just an understanding, shared by everyone who mattered in this city, that this was not a public space. Inside, it was a different world entirely. The music moved through the room like a living thing. Deep, rolling bass lines that settled into your chest and stayed there. Neon bled across every surface in shades of purple and blue, catching the edges of glasses, the shoulders of expensive suits, the jewelry of women who had learned long ago that in a room like this, appearance was currency. The bar ran the full length of one wall, staffed by 4 bartenders who moved with the synchronized precision of people who had been trained to be fast, silent, and forgettable. Lila had worked here for 3 months. She had not taken the job because she needed the money, though the money was real enough. She had taken it because Club Obsidian was the one place in Seoul where Kai Park was guaranteed to appear every Friday night. And Lila had spent the better part of 2 years working her way close enough to that guarantee to do something with it. She was 26 years old. She was from Lagos by birth, Seoul by circumstance, and from a world most people in this club would never understand by inheritance. She moved through the room now with the kind of muscle memory that comes from months of watching. The layout absorbed, the blind spots catalogued, the rotation of security personnel mapped against the positions of every camera in the building. She knew this room the way surgeons know anatomy. Precisely. Without sentiment. Table 7 sat elevated above the rest of the floor by 3 steps. A detail that seemed architectural, but was entirely intentional. Everything about Kai Park's environment was intentional. The elevation put him slightly above everyone else in his immediate radius. The booth was positioned at the back corner, giving him full sight lines to the entrance and the bar while keeping his back protected. 2 of his men stood at the base of those steps at all times. Not because they were decorative, because Kai had not survived this long by being careless. He was 34, the youngest person to ever consolidate control over Seoul's Bozong network. A loose confederation of gambling operations, private security contracts, and import arrangements that the authorities officially couldn't prove existed and unofficially chose not to investigate too aggressively. He had inherited a fractured organization at 28 and spent 6 years turning it into something that ran like a machine. Quiet, efficient, and merciless when it needed to be. He was also, Lila had come to understand, a man who had never once been told no by anyone in a position to enforce it. That was his vulnerability. She had been carrying the tray toward his booth when the woman at the table shifted. A sudden movement. An arm swinging wide mid-laugh, catching the edge of Lila's tray at precisely the wrong angle. The glass had no choice. Physics had no interest in the consequences. It tilted, it fell, and it emptied itself directly into Kai's lap before either of them could do anything about it. She had begun her apology immediately. Genuinely. Not because she feared him, though she understood exactly what fear of him looked like on other people's faces, but because this was not the moment she had planned for. An improvisation in Kai Park's orbit carried a cost she had not yet calculated. He hadn't let her finish the apology. The slap had come instead. And now, as she pressed a cloth briefly to her cheek at the bar, and watched her reflection in the mirror behind the bottles, Lila allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of stillness. 5 seconds to feel it. The burn. The humiliation. The weight of every eye that had seen it and looked away. Then she folded the cloth neatly, placed it on the bar, and looked up. Across the room, at table 7. Kai was already laughing at something one of the women had said. He had moved on completely. To him, what had just happened was already forgotten. The way you forget a door you've closed. It required no further thought because it had required no effort. That was the thing about men like Kai. They never imagined that the people they dismissed were paying attention. Lila was always paying attention. She picked up her next tray, straightened her uniform, and went back to work. Somewhere in the booth above, the quiet young man who had sat slightly apart from the others, Ray, watched her cross the room. His expression was unreadable, but he watched for longer than was necessary. That, too, Lila had noticed. She noticed everything. Kai summoned the club manager before the night was half over. His name was Mr. Shin, a small, perpetually nervous man who had managed Club Obsidian for 7 years, and had survived that long because he understood one rule above everything else. When Kai Park wanted something, the correct response was not a question. It was immediate, quiet action. Mr. Shin arrived at table 7 within 90 seconds. He stood at the base of the 3 steps, hands clasped, and listened while Kai explained, in a voice almost pleasant in its calmness, that the waitress who had ruined his evening needed to be dealt with. He didn't specify what that meant. He didn't need to. Everyone within the radius of that booth understood perfectly. "I want her off the floor tonight," Kai said, adjusting his cufflink without looking up. "And I want it to mean something." Mr. Shin nodded 3 times rapidly and disappeared into the crowd. He found Lila at the service station near the east wall, restocking her tray. He didn't look at her directly when he spoke, and that was how Lila knew the conversation was serious. People in this building only avoided eye contact when delivering news they didn't want to be associated with. "Mr. Park wants you on kitchen support for the rest of the night," Mr. Shin said. Quietly, quickly, effective immediately. Lila looked at him steadily. "I haven't done anything wrong." "I know," he said. And he genuinely seemed to. There was something almost apologetic beneath his practiced neutrality. "It doesn't matter." "It should." He finally looked at her. Just briefly. "Please, Lila. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She held his gaze, then set her tray down and nodded once. She walked toward the kitchen without argument, without visible anger, without giving anyone watching the satisfaction of seeing her break. Inside, surrounded by the clatter of plates and the heat of industrial stoves, She stood near the back wall and thought carefully. Being removed from the floor was an inconvenience she had anticipated. Some form of public consequence was inevitable. Kai needed to demonstrate authority in front of his circle. What she hadn't anticipated was the speed. He had moved within minutes, which told her something valuable. Kai Park did not let discomfort resolve itself. He acted immediately, decisively, and without consultation. That was useful information. She filed it carefully. What mattered more was how he had responded. He had gone through Mr. Shin, used the club structure as his instrument, which meant that for all his power, Kai still operated through systems, through chains of instruction, through people who carried out his will on his behalf. Systems had gaps. Chains had weak links. She spent the rest of her shift in the kitchen and used every minute of it thinking. Ray found her near the service exit at the end of the night. She heard the footsteps before she saw him, deliberate, unhurried, clearly meant for her. She turned before he reached her. Up close, he was younger than he appeared from across the room. Maybe 29, with the kind of face that suggested he had been openly expressive once, before something had taught him to be careful. His suit was slightly less precise than the others in Kai's circle. Jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened, as though the formality was a costume he wore without fully committing to. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately place. Not predatory. Not exactly sympathetic. Somewhere between the two. In the territory of someone curious about something they weren't sure they should pursue. "You're still here," he said. "My shift ended 20 minutes ago," Lila replied. "I was leaving." "I know." He glanced toward the door, then back. "That's not what I meant." She waited. "Most people," he said carefully, "after what happened tonight, they don't come back. They call in sick the next day. Then they find something else entirely. I'm not most people." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like recognition. The slight adjustment a person makes when something confirms a quiet suspicion they've been carrying. "No," he said. "I didn't think you were." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are deciding simultaneously how much to reveal and how much to preserve. "What do you want?" Lila asked. Directly. Without hostility but without patience for anything decorative. Ray considered the question as though it deserved genuine thought. "I wanted to see if you were all right." "I am. And I wanted to tell you," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "that what happened tonight wasn't," he paused. "Chose carefully." It wasn't necessary. Even by his standards. Lila studied him. This was interesting. Not because someone in Kai's organization was expressing something resembling conscience. She had encountered that before, the guilt of people doing terrible things adjacent to worse people. What was interesting was that he was expressing it to her. Here. Alone. At the service exit where no camera covered the angle properly. He knew that. She was certain he knew that. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because someone should," he said simply. He held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, small, decisive, like a period at the end of a sentence, and walked back inside. Lila stood very still after the door closed. Then she smiled. Very slightly. Very briefly. Ray was not simply a quiet man sitting apart from the others. He was a man with an unsolved problem. And men with unsolved problems were far more useful than men without any problems at all. She walked out into the Seoul night, hands in her pockets, and let the cold air settle around her. There was work to do. And now finally it could begin properly. Monday came quietly. Lila arrived at Club Obsidian 40 minutes before her shift began. She used those 40 minutes the way she always did. Walking the perimeter slowly. Checking delivery entrances. Watching who came and went through the staff door. Noting which security rotation had changed since Friday and which had stayed the same. Small observations. The kind that only mattered if you were building something deliberately. Mr. Shin met her at the staff entrance with the expression of a man who had spent the weekend hoping she wouldn't return. "You're on kitchen support again tonight," he said. Not unkindly. Just factually, the way a doctor delivers news they didn't cause and cannot change. "I understand," Lila said. He blinked. He had clearly prepared for resistance. Her agreement disarmed him completely. And in that brief moment of disarmament she saw something she needed: relief. Mr. Shin was not her enemy. He was a man trapped between a paycheck and a conscience, doing the mathematics of survival the way most people in Kai's orbit did. He was manageable. More than manageable. He was useful. "Mr. Shin," she said as he turned to go. "The inventory system in the kitchen, the digital one. It's been logging errors since last Wednesday. Someone should look at it before Friday's order goes out." He turned back. Frowned slightly. "How do you know that?" "I was in the kitchen Friday night," she said simply. "I noticed." He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly and walked away. She watched him go and made a quiet internal note. The inventory system wasn't actually malfunctioning. But by Wednesday, when Mr. Shin sent someone to investigate, that person would spend time on a problem that didn't exist. Time that would otherwise go towards something else entirely. A minor disruption. Almost invisible. Almost invisible was precisely what she needed right now. The kitchen operated on a logic completely separate from the glamour above it. No neon, no carefully calibrated music, no performance. Just heat and noise and the brutal efficiency of people who had learned to move in tight spaces without colliding. Lila integrated herself within 2 nights. Learning names, mapping the informal hierarchy, identifying who talked too much and who observed everything in silence. The one who talked too much was a young prep cook named Juno. He was 22, cheerful in the specific way of someone who hadn't yet learned that cheerfulness in this environment was a liability. And he possessed an extraordinary talent for knowing things he shouldn't. Table 7 had a private meeting Sunday afternoon, he told her Tuesday, while they restocked cold storage. He delivered it the way people share weather information, casually without attaching significance. 3 cars. People I've never seen before. They were upstairs almost 2 hours. Lila kept her hands moving. "Sounds important." "Mr. Beck was there," Juno continued. Juno always continued. "You know Mr. Beck?" "I know the name. He runs the Incheon side. He and Mr. Park don't usually meet in person." He paused, apparently deciding whether the next part was worth sharing, then deciding it was. Ray was the only one from Mr. Park's regular group who wasn't in the room. Lila's hands stopped for exactly half a second, then continued. "Interesting," she said. Lightly, as though mildly so and nothing more. Juno nodded, and moved on to something else entirely, blissfully unaware that he had just handed her something significant. She spent the rest of her shift turning it over quietly. Ray had been excluded from a meeting between Kai and the Incheon leadership. That could mean several things. Kai's trust in him was eroding. The meeting concerned something Ray wasn't cleared for. Or, and this was the possibility that interested her most, Ray already knew what the meeting was about, and had chosen deliberately to absent himself. Distance was a strategy. She understood that better than most. She thought about the service exit. The careful words. The way he had said even by his standards, as though measuring the space between himself and Kai with something beyond professional loyalty. Ray was not simply a lieutenant with doubts. Ray was a man quietly constructing an exit. She needed to know how far along the construction was. Wednesday brought something unexpected. Lila was working the main floor. Mr. Shin had quietly returned her to floor duty. Apparently deciding the kitchen reassignment had served its symbolic purpose. When a particular energy moved through the room. Not panic. Something more controlled than panic. but closely related to it. The kind of focused alertness that ripples outward when someone significant arrives without announcement. She tracked it without turning her head. At the entrance, a woman had walked in with the kind of presence that required no introduction. Perhaps 50, dressed in the understated elegance of someone who had learned long ago that wealth announced itself more powerfully through restraint than excess. Silver at her temples. Posture that belonged to a person who had never once entered a room uncertain of her welcome. 2 men followed 3 steps behind. Not bodyguards exactly, but people capable of becoming bodyguards if the situation required it. Lila recognized her. Not from Seoul. From a photograph tucked into the back of a file her father had kept in the locked drawer of his desk in Lagos. A drawer she had opened after his funeral with the key she found in his coat pocket. The file contained many photographs. This woman's had been labeled with a single word in her father's careful handwriting. Careful. Her name was Madame Yoon. She was, depending on who you asked, either a legitimate businesswoman with interests in real estate and private equity, or the financial architect behind every significant money movement the Bozong network had made in the last decade. The 2 descriptions were not mutually exclusive. They were designed to coexist, the legitimate surface existing precisely to make everything beneath it invisible. She was also the person who had recommended the timing of the move against the Adeyemi family's Seoul operation. She hadn't pulled any triggers. She never did. But she had looked at the numbers, calculated the optimal window, and told the people who made decisions that the window was open. Lila's father had died 3 days later. Madame Yoon's eyes moved across the room systematically, not enjoying the atmosphere, but reading it, the way someone reads a balance sheet. She paused at certain tables, exchanged brief words, smiled occasionally in the most controlled way Lila had ever witnessed. Then her gaze landed on Lila. It lasted less than 2 seconds. It moved on smoothly, as though Lila were simply furniture being catalogued. But in those 2 seconds something had passed between them. A quality of attention so precise and so brief that most people would have missed it entirely. Lila did not miss anything. She picked up her tray and kept working. Her breathing stayed even. Her face stayed neutral. But her father's handwriting stayed with her for the rest of the night, steady and insistent, like a hand on her shoulder. Careful. She intended to be. If Madame Yoon's arrival just gave you chills, you're not alone. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Do you think Lila's cover is still safe? Because what happens next is going to test everything she has built. Thursday, Lila made her first real move. The security system at Club Obsidian ran on a network that was theoretically isolated. A closed circuit with no external access points, managed by a private firm Kai used exclusively across all his properties. Theoretically isolated was not the same as actually isolated. She had learned this months ago from a contact she had cultivated carefully. A technician who serviced the system quarterly and who, like Juno, had a talent for sharing information that exceeded his talent for understanding its value. She didn't touch the cameras. Touching the cameras would have been noticed immediately. What she touched instead was the logging schedule, the automated record of when each camera completed its rotation cycle. A minor adjustment, buried 3 layers deep in administrative settings, the kind of change that looked like a software hiccup rather than deliberate interference. What it meant in practice was that camera 4, covering the corridor between the main office and the private meeting room on the upper floor, would log its rotation 2 minutes earlier than it actually completed it. 2 minutes was nothing to most people. To Lila, 2 minutes was a window. She made the adjustment from her apartment through a relay that left no direct trace, then closed the laptop and sat in the dark thinking about what her father used to say about patience. He had told her once, when she was 12 and furious about something she could no longer remember, that the most dangerous person in any room was never the loudest one. The loudest person was performing. Performance required attention. And attention was the one resource you could not afford to split. The dangerous person was the one who appeared to require nothing, who seemed content, who made themselves easy to overlook. Be easy to overlook, he had said. Until the moment you cannot be. She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now with the particular sharpness of someone taught something in theory, and then forced to learn it again through grief. Friday night, Ray found her again. Not at the service exit this time. At the bar, during a brief gap in her section when the cluster of people she'd been serving had temporarily thinned, and she was waiting for a drink's order. He appeared beside her with the naturalness of someone who had planned the approach carefully enough that it didn't look planned. "You came back," he said. "You keep saying that like it surprises you." "It does," he said. "A little." She glanced at him sideways. He was looking straight ahead at the bottles behind the bar. The way people look at something neutral when the real conversation is happening in their peripheral vision. "Ray," she said. His name in her mouth for the first time. She watched him register it, a small, almost imperceptible adjustment in his posture. "What do you actually want?" He was quiet for a moment. The bartender slid her order across the bar, and she began arranging glasses on her tray, without breaking the silence. She had learned that silence, applied correctly, was the most effective question in any room. "I want to know," he said finally quietly, "what you're planning." Her hands continued moving, smoothly, without interruption. "I'm planning to finish my shift," she said, "then go home and sleep." He looked at her then, directly, with the full weight of someone who had decided to stop being careful, at least for this one moment. "Lila." Her name in his mouth now. Deliberate. "I've been watching you for 3 weeks. You are not what you appear to be in this building. And whatever you're building," he paused, "you should know that you don't have as much time as you think." She picked up her tray, met his eyes steadily. "Then I'll have to work faster," she said. She walked back onto the floor. Behind her, Ray stood at the bar a long moment. He ordered a drink he didn't touch and stared at it, and thought about what he had just done. He had shown his hand. He was not sure yet whether that had been a mistake. Saturday morning, Lila met a contact named Sujin at a cafe in Mapo. They had connected 18 months ago through a mutual acquaintance in the financial compliance world. A world Lila had navigated carefully in the period between her father's death and her arrival in Seoul. Sujin was 31, meticulous, and possessed the specific talent of someone who could read corporate filings the way other people read novels, with attention to character, motivation, and everything deliberately left unsaid. She placed a slim folder on the table between them without greeting. "Bozong is restructuring," she said quietly. "Not publicly. The financial architecture has been shifting for 6 weeks. Shell entities being consolidated, certain accounts quietly closed, new structures opening in jurisdictions that are," she paused, "less transparent than the current ones." Lila looked at the folder without opening it. "What does that mean practically?" "Someone is preparing to move significant assets," Sujin said. "The kind of move you make when you're either expanding aggressively or anticipating instability." "Which one?" "The closures suggest the latter. You don't close established structures when expanding. You open new ones alongside them. Closing and consolidating means reducing your footprint. Reducing your footprint means expecting scrutiny." She looked at Lila evenly. "Or expecting a transition." Lila opened the folder. The documents were dense. Columns of figures, entity names, jurisdiction codes. She moved through the pages efficiently, extracting only what she needed. 2 things stood out immediately. The name of the primary receiving entity in the new structure. And the timeline. The consolidation was scheduled to complete within 3 weeks. She closed the folder and slid it back. "Thank you," she said. Sujin picked it up and returned it to her bag. "Lila, Said carefully, the way people say names when what they mean is a question they haven't decided to ask yet. Whatever you're doing, 3 weeks is not much room. No, Lila agreed. It isn't. She paid for both coffees and walked back into the cold Seoul morning. Around the corner, completely alone, she stopped walking and stood still on the pavement while people moved around her. She breathed carefully. She thought about her father. He had built his Seoul operation over 20 years. Kai had dismantled it in a weekend. 3 days later, her father was gone. 3 weeks was enough time. It had to be. Because if Kai completed his consolidation and disappeared into a new structure she hadn't mapped, that was not something she was prepared to accept. She started walking again. Faster this time. Sunday evening, Kai summoned her to table 7. She was halfway through her shift when Juno appeared at her elbow, his usual cheerfulness replaced by something quieter and more urgent. Mr. Park is asking for you specifically, he said. East Section waitress. Mr. Shin confirmed it was you. 20 minutes. Lila nodded slowly. Thank you, Juno. He hovered briefly, clearly wanting to say something cautionary, then apparently deciding it wouldn't help either of them. He walked away. Lila stood still for a count of 5. Then she smoothed her uniform, leveled her tray, and began walking toward table 7. She would show him nothing useful. She would be exactly what he expected. Attentive, professional, slightly diminished by what had happened the week before. She would perform the version of herself that made her invisible. She climbed the 3 steps. Kai looked up with the expression of a man who hadn't yet decided what he wanted from this interaction. That, she recognized, was more dangerous than a man who already had. Sit, he said. She sat across from him, tray balanced on her knees, and waited. He studied her for a long, unhurried moment. Then he said something she hadn't anticipated. You're not afraid of me, he said. Not accusingly. Almost with genuine curiosity. Why not? She held his gaze without flinching and said, with perfect steadiness, I'm just a waitress, Mr. Park. He looked at her another long moment. Then very slowly he smiled. It was the most unsettling thing she had witnessed in this building. Kai's smile didn't reach his eyes. That was the thing about it. The thing that made it more unsettling than anger would have been. Anger was readable. Anger had a shape and a direction, and a predictable arc. But this smile existed in a register entirely its own, somewhere between amusement and calculation. And it told her nothing except that he was thinking something he had chosen not to say yet. Just a waitress, he repeated slowly, tasting the words. That's an interesting way to describe yourself. It's accurate, she said. Is it? Not a question. A consideration. He leaned back in his seat and looked at her the way a person looks at something they've decided to examine more closely. Not with hostility, but with the particular attention of someone who suspects they've been careless about something, and is now correcting that carelessness. It was a subtle shift. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. Lila noticed everything. You've been here 3 months, he said. Yes. You're good at your job. I try to be. You don't seem frightened. He tilted his head slightly. After last week, most people would be frightened. I'm focused on my work, Mr. Park. He studied her another moment. Then he gestured a small dismissive wave and said, You can go. She stood, adjusted her tray, and descended the 3 steps without hurrying. Behind her, she heard him say something to the man beside him. Too low to catch clearly, but the tone was thoughtful rather than dismissive. That distinction mattered enormously. He was thinking about her. Not in the way she wanted him to, not yet, but the attention had shifted from indifferent to active, and active attention from Kai Park was a variable she needed to manage carefully from this point forward. She had perhaps 48 hours before his curiosity either resolved itself into something dangerous, or dissipated entirely. She needed it to dissipate. She needed to give him something that satisfied the question without answering it. She knew exactly what that something was. Monday, she made a mistake. A deliberate one. She arrived for her shift, and within the first hour managed to misplace an entire drinks order for a table of Kai's mid-level associates. Men important enough to matter but not important enough to sit at table 7. She brought the wrong bottles, apologized with precisely the right amount of flustered embarrassment, corrected it quickly and moved on. It was a small, visible error. The kind a distracted person makes. The kind that confirmed, to anyone watching, that she was rattled by the previous week's events. People believed what they expected to believe. They expected a young woman in her position, after a public humiliation, to be slightly off her rhythm. She gave them exactly that and nothing more. By the end of the night, the story moving quietly through the staff was that the new waitress was struggling to recover. Mr. Shin had heard it from 2 separate people before midnight. He mentioned it to Lila gently near the end of her shift, suggesting she take a night off if she needed it. "I'm fine," she said, with just enough strain in her voice to suggest she wasn't entirely. He nodded sympathetically and left her alone. Across the room, at his usual position near the wall, one of Kai's men watched her gather her things and leave. She felt his eyes on her back and kept her shoulders slightly drawn in, her movements slightly less fluid than usual. She maintained the performance all the way to the street. Then she straightened completely and walked home at her normal pace. Tuesday, Ray made his move. She was at the service station when he appeared beside her. Not at the bar this time, not at the exit, but here in the middle of the working floor, which was either bold or careless, and she hadn't yet determined which. He kept his eyes forward and spoke without turning toward her, his voice low beneath the music. "There's a meeting Thursday night," he said. "Upper floor. Kai, Beck, and 2 people from outside the network. It starts at 11 after the club closes." Lila restocked her tray without pausing. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you need to know the timeline is moving faster than Sujin's documents suggest." She went very still internally. Externally, nothing changed. He knew about Sujin. She kept her hands moving, her face composed, and ran the implications of that quickly and quietly through her mind. Either Ray had been watching her more comprehensively than she had realized, or he had his own sources inside the same financial compliance world Sujin operated in. Either way, it told her something important. Ray was not simply offering assistance out of conscience or convenience. He had been doing his own preparation. "What do you want in return?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "When it's over, I want out. Clean. No trail that leads back to me." "That depends on how useful you are." "Thursday night," he said. "Camera 4 corridor. The 2-minute window you already know about." He paused just long enough for her to understand that he knew about that too. "There's a secondary device in Kai's desk. 3rd drawer. It has everything you need to understand what Thursday's meeting is actually about." He walked away before she could respond. She stood at the service station and breathed carefully. Her hands had stopped moving at some point without her noticing. She started them again. Ray had just told her 2 things simultaneously. That he knew more about her operation than she had believed possible, and that he was choosing to use that knowledge to help her rather than expose her. That was either the most valuable development since she arrived in Seoul, or it was a trap constructed with extraordinary patience and precision. She thought about it for the rest of the shift, and did not reach a conclusion she trusted completely, which meant she needed to move as though both possibilities were true simultaneously. Take what Ray was offering while protecting against the possibility that taking it was exactly what someone wanted her to do. It was the most difficult kind of thinking. She had learned to do it from her father. She missed him with a sharpness that still surprised her sometimes, arriving without warning in the middle of ordinary moments. She let herself feel it for exactly the length of time it took to carry a full tray across the room. Then she set it down and got back to work. Wednesday, she went back to the apartment and stood in front of the wall. Everything she had built over 2 years looked back at her. The photographs, the documents, the string connecting names to dates to locations. Madame Yoon's name now connected to Kai's in a different color. Ray's name added recently, with a question mark she hadn't yet removed. 3 weeks had become 10 days. 10 days was tight. 10 days meant she could no longer afford the gradual, invisible accumulation of small advantages she had been relying on. She needed to accelerate. She needed Thursday's meeting to give her what the secondary device apparently contained. She needed Ray to be exactly what he appeared to be, and not what her caution kept warning her he might be. She needed several things to go right simultaneously. That was not a comfortable position. She had spent 2 years engineering a situation where she would never need several things to go right simultaneously, where each element would be secured independently before the next one was touched. That architecture was still largely intact, but the timeline had compressed it. She thought about Kai's smile, the way it hadn't reached his eyes. She thought about her father's voice. Be easy to overlook. Until the moment you cannot be. She was still overlookable. Just barely. She needed to stay that way through Thursday. After Thursday, it wouldn't matter anymore. She turned off the light and went to prepare. Thursday night arrived like a held breath. Lila was outside Club Obsidian by 10:15. Not in uniform. Not through the staff entrance. She wore dark, unremarkable clothing and approached through the narrow service alley behind the building. The one with the delivery entrance whose code hadn't changed in 18 months. The club had been closed for 40 minutes. Cleaning staff were gone. 2 of Kai's men were posted at the front entrance outside. 1 more patrolled the ground floor on a 12-minute circuit she had mapped across 3 previous visits. She climbed the internal staircase. The upper corridor was dark except for the pale strip of light beneath the office door. Voices moved through it. Low, controlled, the tone of men conducting serious business. She counted 4 distinct voices. Kai's was immediately recognizable. Beck's she had heard once before. The other 2 were strangers. She positioned herself in the recessed storage doorway opposite the office. Camera 4's logging delay had already activated. She had 2 minutes. She needed 40 seconds. She was back in the alcove in 38. The secondary device from Kai's third drawer was processed and replaced exactly as she found it. She descended the stairs, crossed the kitchen, exited through the delivery entrance, and walked 3 blocks before slowing her pace. In her apartment 20 minutes later, she reviewed what the device had given her. It was more than she had hoped for, and worse than she had feared. The Thursday meeting was not about expansion. It was about dissolution. Kai was liquidating the Bozong Network's assets quietly, systematically, in a structure designed so that when the liquidation was complete, the money would exist attached to his name alone. Not the network. Not Beck. Not Madame Yoon. Not any stakeholder who had built this alongside him. He was going to take everything and disappear. The timeline was not 3 weeks. It was 8 days. There was something else buried in the device's communication records, a name she recognized from her father's file. Not marked with a warning. Just noted once, in the margin of a page about the Adeyemi operation. A name that connected her father's death to someone who had been present in Lagos. Someone who had known him personally. Someone she had trusted once. She sat with that for a long time. Then she folded it into the place where she kept things that were true and painful, and could not be undone. She picked up her phone and sent Ray 1 message. Tomorrow. Same exit. 10 o'clock. His response came in under a minute. I'll be there. Ray arrived at 9:58 looking like a man who hadn't found a stopping point in his thinking for several days. 8 days, she said. He exhaled. I found out 2 days ago. He's been planning this for 4 months. Everyone around him has been kept busy while he moves the architecture underneath them. He paused. Including me. He said it without visible emotion. But something moved behind his eyes. The expression of a person absorbing a betrayal they had suspected and hadn't wanted to confirm. I need access to the upper floor Friday night, Lila said. During the event. While the room is full and his attention is divided. What are you going to do? Ray asked. What needs to be done? He held her gaze with the weight of someone who understood that certain decisions cannot be unmade. Then he said, I'll get you access. And I'll handle the 2 men on the upper corridor. Without drawing attention. Without drawing attention, he confirmed. She nodded once. Then we're ready. Friday arrived quietly, indistinguishably, the way endings always do. Club Obsidian filled as it always did. Music rolled through the floor. Neon bled purple and blue across every surface. At table 7, elevated above the room by 3 steps, Kai Park sat at the center of his circle with the ease of a man who had never imagined the architecture beneath him was already gone. At 9:50, Ray's message arrived. Corridor is clear. Lila set her tray down, smoothed her uniform one final time, and walked toward the internal staircase without looking back. Upstairs, the office door was unlocked. She stepped inside, closed it behind her, positioned herself where she needed to be, and waited. 11 minutes later, footsteps on the stairs. The door opened. Kai stepped inside and stopped. His expression moved through surprise, and then something sharper. The beginning of understanding arriving in real time. She watched it assemble itself and said nothing until it was complete. You're Adeyemi's daughter, he said. I am, she said. She placed 3 things on the desk between them. The processed contents of the secondary device. Sujin's financial documents, printed and organized like a verdict. A full transcript of Thursday's meeting. Every account you moved is flagged, she said. Every entity you opened in every jurisdiction is already known to people who will act before Monday morning. Beck knows. Madame Yoon knows. The network knows exactly what you were planning to do with their share. She paused. The person who told them has been carrying your drinks for 3 months. Kai looked at the desk. Then at her. His composure was extraordinary. She gave him that. But composure, in the end, was just another performance. And performances required an audience willing to believe them. She picked up her bag. My father built something over 20 years, she said. You took it apart in a weekend. She looked at him one final time from the doorway. It took me 2 years to return the favor. I think that's remarkably efficient. She walked out. Downstairs, the music was still playing. She moved through the crowd, through the front door, past the men at the entrance who didn't look at her twice, and out into the Seoul night. 3 blocks away, Ray fell into step beside her. It's done, he said. It's done, she said. They walked in silence for a moment. The city moved around them, indifferent, luminous, completely unaware of what had just shifted within it. Where do we go now? He asked. She looked at the lights ahead and said, somewhere they're not looking. She kept walking, shoulders straight, head up, the burn on her cheek long gone, leaving nothing behind except the memory of the moment she had decided what it would cost. It had cost 2 years. It had been worth every single day. And that is the end of Lila's story, or perhaps just the beginning of her next chapter. If this kept you locked in from the very first second to the last word, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling us, did Lila's revenge satisfy you, or do you want to see what she builds next? Your comments tell us what stories to bring you. We will see you in the next one.